What did Vikings do with captured nuns on their longships? The Viking longships and the nuns of Lindisfarne. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey across cold gray seas, the kind that smell faintly of salt, iron, and wood smoke. So, settle in, maybe pull a blanket up to your chin, and let us drift back to a time when the Vikings were more than just horned helmet caricatures in textbooks. They were real people, in longships that cut through the North Sea like knives through butter, raiding, trading, navigating, and occasionally kidnapping nuns. Yes, nuns. It's 795 AD, and the monastery at Lindisfarne is a peaceful little place, perched on an island off the northeast coast of England. Monks chant, nuns sing, illuminated manuscripts glimmer in candlelight, and then, out of the mist, dragon-headed longships appear on the horizon. Now let's be clear, the monks had zero chance here. They probably had some crude weapons, some wooden shields, maybe a goat to throw if things got desperate. But the Vikings didn't care. They were after treasure, yes, but humans were currency too. Sister Ethelflaed and Sister Brigida and 10 others were dragged aboard these vessels, and from that moment, their lives became a strange blend of captivity, survival, and unintended influence on Viking culture. Let's float over to Ethelflaed for a moment. She was high-born, which meant she had a silver spoon reputation, even among nuns. That didn't save her from the auction in Dublin. Yes, she was literally sold for 12 ounces of silver. And then, of course, she was assigned duties aboard the longship. Star charts, stolen from her monastery, became the tools the Vikings used to navigate unknown waters. So, in a bizarre twist, the captive nun essentially taught them celestial navigation. Irony doesn't even begin to cover it. Sister Brigida, on the other hand, took a very different approach. While her companions endured, she learned the Norse runes. Slowly, meticulously, she inked them onto her captor's chest. Not as decoration, but as a curse. "Curse his seed," she muttered quietly. And legend has it the man never fathered a child afterward. Or maybe he did, and just blamed the ocean. Hard to know, but it adds a touch of poetic revenge to the story. Meanwhile, another nun, whose name was lost to time but whose actions were not, discovered monkshood in the abbey garden. It's a lovely little plant, deadly if misused. She crushed it into the crew's mead. Half the longship ended up hallucinating serpents, fighting invisible enemies, or trying to row backward into storms. Chaos ensued, naturally, because what's a voyage without a bit of mayhem? Interestingly, not all Viking captors were monsters. Some treated their human cargo with functional respect. After all, these nuns were assets, navigators, healers, messengers, and sometimes bargaining chips. And over the years, some nuns were sold further afield, like to Constantinople, where they were integrated into harems. And here's the kicker. 2 of them converted to Islam, became pirate queens, and commanded fleets. That's right. From monastic life to maritime rule. Not a career path most people would choose, but somehow, these women made it work. Meanwhile, back on the northern seas, sagas recorded the nuns who resisted. There is the famous depiction of a nun wielding an axe beside a Viking in a 9th century Irish cross carving. Proof that some women didn't just survive, they fought. And yes, there's archaeological evidence to back it up. In 2022, bones were uncovered under Oslo NS harbor showing battle scars. And gold teeth, clearly looted from Byzantine treasures, and clearly worn by women who weren't afraid to bite back. Life aboard a longship wasn't easy for anyone. Imagine the constant rocking, the smell of salt and iron, and the occasional human excrement, the cries of men, the chants of nuns trying to maintain some semblance of prayer amidst all the chaos. The longships became microcosms of society, twisted, chaotic, yet strangely functional. And of course, the Vikings themselves were contradictory beings. Ruthless raiders, yes, but also traders, navigators, artisans. They respected skill and cunning, whether in battle or in subterfuge. So when a nun managed to poison mead or curse a man, or teach them the stars, she earned a strange form of recognition. By the time the longships reached distant shores, the nuns had become part of a world that would never have existed without Viking raids. Their influence was subtle, often overlooked, but real. Some guided fleets, some ruled in foreign courts, Some died along the way, leaving only skeletal traces of a life both captive and defiant. So, as we drift over these northern waters in our imaginations, it's worth reflecting on the sheer absurdity, the dark humor, and the resilience of these women. They were instruments of the Vikings' success, yet agents of their own subtle revenge. They were prisoners and navigators, victims and warriors, and in their quiet courage, they left echoes that historians are still uncovering centuries later. Life aboard the longships, nuns, navigation, and survival. All right, let's settle in and imagine the longship itself. These weren't just boats. They were narrow wooden beasts, carved for speed, decorated with dragon heads that probably scared local wildlife more than anyone else. They rocked gently on the waves, though gently is relative. If you were a nun clutching a pewter mug of mead, every wave was a rolling invitation to disaster. The nuns had no choice but to adapt quickly. Daily life was a mixture of ritual, survival, and subtle sabotage. Some, like Ethelflaed, became unofficial navigators. She pointed out constellations, calculated tides, and murmured prayers to guide the vessel safely through unknown waters. Imagine the Vikings, gruff, tattooed men with axes and furs, taking advice from a woman in a habit who had never touched a sword. The irony must have been delicious to her, even if she didn't smile much. Brigida, of course, continued her work in quieter ways. Her runes were more than ink on skin. They were small acts of rebellion. Some say she whispered spells at night while cleaning the deck, and every so often, a crew member would get sick or lose his nerve mid-battle. Whether superstition or skill, it created a reputation that made even the roughest warriors hesitate. The longship's daily routine was chaotic yet oddly structured. Men rode in shifts. The nuns tended to cooking, cleaning, and care of the wounded. They learned quickly which herbs could calm seasickness and which could calm anger, sometimes in the same potion. One account suggests a nun was able to treat a Viking with a broken arm using crushed bark and prayers, earning the crew's reluctant respect. And when half the ship hallucinated from monkshood-laced mead, the other half learned to row faster to stay ahead of imaginary serpents. Efficiency born of terror, not unusual for a Viking voyage. There was also boredom, endless hours at sea, staring at endless water, punctuated by the occasional screaming or cheering. Ethelflaed wrote in her journal. Yes, she managed to keep a hidden journal, because why not document your captivity? That she spent hours teaching some of the younger crew to read Latin letters, which confused them immensely, but kept her occupied. Education as subtle resistance, smart, strategic, and slightly infuriating to the Vikings who wanted quiet obedience. Food was meager and often repetitive. Salted fish, hard bread, and occasionally something fresher if they raided successfully. The nuns had to cook in cramped conditions while avoiding the swaying deck, and sometimes one would accidentally season the stew with a little monkshood just to keep things interesting. The hallucinations didn't last, but the stories spread among the crew like wildfire. One can imagine a Viking sailor later telling his children about the nuns who made the ship see serpents, embellishing each retelling. History remembers chaos, sometimes better than order. The emotional strain was constant. Many of these women were young, some barely teenagers. The trauma of being torn from a monastery, thrust into a world of violence, and forced to serve as both human currency and skilled labor could have broken anyone. Yet they adapted. Some prayed endlessly, others silently cursed. A few even laughed quietly at the absurdity of teaching star navigation to a tattooed man named Olaf, who still thought a goat-esque skull was a good luck charm. As the longships moved along coasts, they occasionally stopped at smaller settlements. Nuns were sometimes sent ashore, under guard, to scout or negotiate. Imagine Sister Ethelflaed walking into a foreign village, with men at her back, carrying coins from her auction, giving advice to a Viking chieftain. Diplomacy under duress. She could have been wearing a habit or some stolen tunic, but either way, she became an agent of influence, one step removed from power, but no less capable. Over time, some nuns began to learn the Norse language. They picked up subtle gestures, vocabulary, and customs. In doing so, they gained slight leverage. Knowledge became survival. Sister Brigida, for example, could whisper warnings about tides or enemy positions, and her captors would listen. The power dynamic shifted slightly. Not enough to free them, but enough to matter. And as the sagas hint, this knowledge later gave some of them the ability to negotiate or escape, or even rise in social ranks in distant lands. And then there's the darker humor of it all. The Vikings had a crude sense of entertainment, and the nuns learned to navigate that. A stolen loaf of bread could become a tiny rebellion. A misdrawn rune could spell minor annoyance. A small act of sabotage could disrupt a raid. Every day was a chess match played against men twice their size, using intellect, cunning, and prayer instead of brute force. By the time the longships reached Dublin, the nuns had survived storms, seasickness, and the occasional hallucinating crew member. Ethelflaed's auction took place, 12 ounces of silver, a price set not for her skill, but for her status. And yet, even here, she influenced the Vikings. Her knowledge of stars helped navigate unfamiliar rivers, her calm demeanor lent stability to chaos, and her quiet cunning ensured that she and some companions would survive further adventures. Some of the nuns, after being sold, ended up in Constantinople. There, they entered harems or merchant households, and a few even became pirate queens. The audacity of going from monastery to longship to harem to pirate fleet is staggering, and it's worth pausing on that thought. These women transformed captivity into opportunity, survival into legacy, all without ever losing their sense of self. Life on a longship, as you can see, wasn't simply survival. It was negotiation, adaptation, and subtle rebellion. And in that strange, rocking world of salt, iron, and prayer, the nuns left their mark on the ship, the crew, and history itself. Subtle resistance and the unlikely power of nuns. All right, let's drift further into the longship's strange ecosystem. By now, the nuns had learned the rhythm of life aboard these vessels, which is to say they were no longer merely captives. They were reluctant participants in the Viking world, forced to navigate not just the seas, but the whims, fears, and egos of their captors. And let's be honest, Vikings were unpredictable. One minute, they were drinking mead and singing sagas. The next, they were shouting curses, brandishing axes, and generally reminding everyone that decorum was optional. Sister Ethelflaed, for instance, had a knack for turning necessity into influence. Her understanding of the stars and tides made her a sort of reluctant advisor. The Vikings, for all their bravado, had no formal schooling in navigation beyond instinct and coastal observation. Ethelflaed's charts and advice were precise. She could tell when a storm was brewing, which currents to follow, which hidden shoals to avoid. It's almost funny to think about. The fearsome, tattooed warriors had to defer to a nun in a habit to reach their destination safely. And yes, she quietly reveled in that ironic superiority. Meanwhile, Sister Brigida's runic tattoos began to take on a life of their own. Her captor, the one cursed to lose his seed, started acting more cautiously, avoiding rash decisions. Other crew members whispered that her subtle magic was real, that the nuns carried invisible power that could affect luck, fate, and even fertility. Superstition, after all, was a Viking's constant companion, and nuns, by virtue of being outsiders with mysterious knowledge, fit perfectly into that role. Not all resistance was mystical, of course. Practical sabotage was equally effective. A nun could misalign an oar, accidentally, oversalt the stew, or quietly tamper with ropes so that sails didn't catch wind properly. These small disruptions weren't catastrophic, but they were infuriating, and, in their way, empowering. The nuns learned to balance defiance with survival, knowing that overt rebellion might end badly, while subtle interventions could shift the daily balance of power in their favor. Life at sea was also about observation. The nuns quickly became historians of the Viking world, noting behavior, customs, and conflicts that would otherwise have gone unrecorded. They saw how raiding parties divided spoils, how leaders maintained loyalty through fear and generosity, and how even the roughest men respected intelligence when cloaked in humility. And in a quiet, almost imperceptible way, the nuns began to insert themselves into these networks, offering advice here, a warning there, all while keeping their true intentions hidden. Humor, too, was a subtle weapon. Imagine Sister Ethelflaed correcting a sailor AS pronunciation of a Latin prayer, while the man is attempting to chant loudly enough for the entire crew to hear, or Brigida placing small curses under the benches. which became inside jokes among the nuns themselves. Humor wasn't about rebellion as much as it was a lifeline, a way to maintain sanity in the rocking chaos of life at sea. And then there were the moments of terrifying practical skill. One nun discovered a stash of monkshood, the deadly plant that had already caused hallucinations among half the crew. She began to use it judiciously, not to kill, but to inspire caution, hesitation, and occasionally sheer awe. Sailors who had once thought themselves invincible now hesitated before a wave, a row, or a command, attributing their fear to the mystical powers of these seemingly fragile captives. In between these acts, the nuns maintained their spiritual lives. Prayer, ritual, and meditation became forms of resistance. They recited psalms quietly, organized silent vigils, and preserved fragments of their monastic routines. This wasn't just comfort, it was strategy. By maintaining mental and spiritual discipline, they remained coherent and focused while chaos reigned around them. The psychological dimension of their captivity cannot be overstated. The Vikings respected strength, not necessarily brute force, but cleverness, cunning, and the ability to endure hardship. The nuns, by surviving storms, hallucinations, and unpredictable captors, earned a grudging respect. They became, in some sense, integral to the functioning of the longship. Without them, navigation would falter, morale would drop, and the ship might literally founder on unseen shoals. Some nuns even began teaching others, younger captives, or occasionally compliant sailors, rudimentary literacy, sewing, or herbal knowledge. They transformed captivity into a kind of informal apprenticeship, blending survival with subtle instruction. Their skills became bargaining tools, enhancing their value without drawing excessive attention to themselves. Of course, the tension was always present. Fear, fatigue, and frustration simmered below the surface. The Vikings were not predictable masters, and moments of cruelty could erupt. But the nuns learned to move with the rhythms of this strange society, to anticipate anger, preempt disorder, and when necessary, employ small acts of cunning to protect themselves and each other. Even in the darkest stretches of the voyage, moments of human connection emerged. Perhaps a sailor, moved by a nun's calm competence, quietly offered extra rations. Perhaps two captives shared a whispered prayer for protection. These small human gestures were lifelines, delicate threads of solidarity in a world dominated by steel, salt, and superstition. By the time the longships approached distant trading hubs, the nuns had evolved from captives into indispensable advisors, cautious tacticians, and subtle manipulators. Their value extended beyond mere survival. They had become actors in the Viking world, shaping outcomes without ever openly defying their captors. And while history rarely remembers such quiet influence, the sagas and archaeological evidence hint at it. Runic tattoos poisoned mead star charts. Battle scars and gold teeth looted from Byzantine palaces all speak to lives that were far more complex than simple victimhood. So as the longships cut through northern waters, the nuns floated along, carrying their faith, knowledge, and ingenuity. Each day was a negotiation between survival and subtle rebellion, between obedience and influence. And through it all, they preserved a sense of identity, a quiet assertion of agency in a world that sought to deny it. Auction, Constantinople, and the unexpected journeys. Now, let's drift to Dublin, where the nuns' journey takes an even stranger turn. By this point, they had survived storms, hallucinations, subtle sabotage, and the unpredictable temper of Viking captors. And yet their trials were far from over. The auction awaited, a public market where human lives were traded like commodities, and the nuns' fates would be decided for silver and influence. Highborn sister Ethelfled, still calm despite everything, was sold for 12 ounces of silver. It seems like a small number, but remember, silver had value, and her social standing as a highborn nun increased her worth. Her sale was recorded in local annals, though historians often overlook it, perhaps because it's uncomfortable to acknowledge the nuanced roles women played in these violent economies. Not all the nuns fared so predictably. Some were bought by local Viking leaders as servants, navigators, or concubines. Others were traded further afield. Constantinople, that glittering city of Byzantium, was a common destination for those sold as slaves. There, the nuns encountered a world entirely different from their northern seas. Marble palaces, exotic markets, and complex social hierarchies challenged everything they had known. And yet, remarkably, a few adapted, not by surrendering, but by navigating their circumstances with strategic intelligence. Some converted to Islam, learned new languages, and even commanded ships. Pirate queens, in a strange twist of fate, emerged from monastic origins. Imagine that. A woman trained to chant psalms, who once walked cloistered halls, now directing fleets across the Mediterranean. It is a transition so improbable it seems almost fictional, yet archaeological and textual evidence suggests it happened. The bones recovered under Oslo in 2022, showing battle scars and gold teeth, hint that some of these women truly wielded influence beyond their capture. Meanwhile, the nuns who remained in Viking domains continued to resist in subtle ways. Sister Brigida's runic curses became legendary. Crew members whispered about them for years, attributing misfortunes, lost fertility, or sudden sickness to her secret power. Other nuns employed knowledge of herbs and sea navigation to maintain a delicate balance. Enough influence to survive, but never so much as to provoke lethal retribution. It's fascinating to consider how their spirituality coexisted with their forced roles. Prayer, meditation, and rituals were maintained under the open sky, over the rolling waves. Sometimes a nun would quietly recite a hymn while watching a Viking row past, her voice calm, steady, almost defiant. This combination of faith and cunning became a subtle but crucial tool for survival. Daily life aboard the longships continued to oscillate between monotony and crisis. The nuns rode alongside men, tended to injuries, and helped plot routes using the stolen star charts. They endured storms, the constant smell of salt and iron, and the occasional hallucination-induced chaos from poisoned mead. Yet, through all of this, they observed, learned, and subtly influenced. The longships were no longer just vehicles of raiding and conquest. They had become classrooms, battlegrounds of wits, and arenas for quiet rebellion. As the voyages extended over months, small networks of alliances formed. Nuns learned which crew members could be persuaded, which captains were mercurial, and which men were easily distracted. A shared understanding emerged. Survival required cooperation, cunning, and an awareness of both the visible and invisible structures of power aboard the ships. When the longships finally approached Constantinople, the nuns' knowledge became invaluable. They could read celestial charts, understand currents, and advise on approaches to unknown ports. Their insights often determined whether the voyages succeeded or faltered. And despite being captives, they quietly carved out positions of importance, leverage that might eventually provide opportunities for freedom or advancement. Some of these women, now in Byzantine territories, began to integrate into local society, albeit under duress. Some were placed in harems or as attendants to wealthy households, while others learned the ways of local politics and trade. A few were able to convert religiously, linguistically, or culturally in ways that gave them authority previously unimaginable. In essence, they transformed captivity into a form of agency, bending circumstances to create paths that defied expectation. All of this, of course, happened while the Vikings continued their own exploits. Back home, they recounted tales of the nuns' cleverness, bravery, and occasional mischief. Some sailors swore they had seen a nun wield an axe defending the ship. Others claimed that the nuns' prayers could calm storms. It's impossible to separate legend from fact, but it's clear that these women left impressions strong enough to echo through sagas and carvings, influencing both memory and myth. By the time some nuns returned to Scandinavia or settled permanently in distant lands, their experiences had irrevocably shaped them. They were no longer simply captives. They were strategists, teachers, survivors, and sometimes leaders. Their influence, while rarely recorded in formal histories, can be traced through archaeological evidence, sagas, and even subtle references in trade and navigational records. So, as we drift away from Dublin's auction markets and the glittering harbors of Constantinople, it becomes clear that the nuns of Lindisfarne were far more than victims. They were agents of survival and subtle influence, reshaping the world around them in ways both practical and symbolic. Their courage, intelligence, and resourcefulness allowed them to navigate a world designed to subjugate them, and in doing so, left traces that echo across centuries. Nuns, runic magic, and the quiet battles at sea now. Let's drift back onto the longships, where the day-to-day life of the nuns reveals the quiet cunning required to survive. By this stage, the nuns had developed a rhythm, a delicate balance of obedience, observation, and subtle resistance. The longship was not just a vessel. It was a small, floating society where power, fear, and superstition intersected in strange ways. Sister Brigida's runic tattoos continued to play a vital role in this strange social ecosystem. Vikings were deeply superstitious. They believed that symbols held real power, and so, a carefully placed rune could change the dynamics aboard a ship. Some sailors avoided certain areas. Others hesitated before acting, and the captains sometimes consulted the nuns' quiet warnings as if they were oracles. It was influence disguised as obedience, clever enough to ensure survival without drawing outright aggression. Meanwhile, Sister Ethelflaed had become more than a navigator. She was a problem solver. Waves, wind, and weather were challenges the Vikings could handle physically, but she solved them intellectually. She calculated tides, predicted storms, and quietly corrected errors in navigation. The men may have been stronger and louder, but she had foresight and calculation on her side. Her influence extended subtly. The longship might arrive safely, and no one noticed she had a hand in it. Other nuns found different ways to assert themselves. Some were healers, tending injuries that might otherwise have become fatal. Some used small acts of sabotage to slow down the crew when necessary, misaligned oars, lightly tampered ropes, or accidentally misplacing supplies. These acts were never overt, but they were psychologically effective. Every minor disruption reminded the crew that the nuns were present, aware, and capable of intervention. Life aboard the longship was a strange mixture of monotony and chaos. There were hours of tedious rowing, punctuated by sudden bursts of panic, storms, hallucinations, or quarrels among the Vikings. The nuns learned to occupy themselves quietly. Some taught each other languages, others practiced herbal remedies, and a few kept secret journals. Writing was not just catharsis. It was a subtle form of control over one's own narrative in a world where agency was constantly under threat. And then there was the mead. The mead. One unlucky or unlucky enough sailor might find it laced with monkshood, just enough to induce mild hallucinations or vertigo. These incidents became part of the nuns' strategy, a way to remind the Vikings that the quiet, cloistered women among them had minds that were clever, cunning, and sometimes dangerous. The result was respect, grudging, fearful, but respect nonetheless. Interestingly, the nuns' influence often extended to morale. They maintained rituals, prayers, and songs that steadied both themselves and sometimes the sailors. Even in their captivity, the nuns preserved a semblance of spiritual authority, reminding the Vikings that not all power resides in the strong or the violent. Occasionally, a sailor would mimic a prayer or hum a hymn, creating a brief bridge between the worlds of faith and fear. As the longships approached foreign lands, the nuns' roles expanded. Some acted as scouts, quietly observing enemy settlements, mapping rivers, or assessing risks. They became observers and advisors without anyone explicitly acknowledging it. Ethelflaed's star charts, Brigida's runes, and the healing knowledge of others all combined into a subtle but potent influence over the voyage's outcomes. Yet the tension remained. Fear and fatigue were constant companions. A misstep could result in violence, illness, or even death. The nuns had to maintain vigilance, often anticipating the moods of captains, the idiosyncrasies of rowers, and the unpredictable environment of the sea. Every day was a negotiation between endurance, subtle defiance, and quiet ingenuity. At night, the longship offered little rest. The nuns would huddle below deck, listening to the waves, the creaking timbers, and the occasional shouted command. Sleep was a fragile thing. Dreams sometimes mixed memories of monasteries with visions of the open sea and hallucinations from monkshood-laced mead. Yet even in these quiet hours, the nuns' minds were active, planning, observing, imagining paths to survival or influence. It's worth noting that some of these women did more than survive. They influenced the Vikings in ways that would ripple through history. In Dublin, Constantinople, or further along the Mediterranean, the nuns' skills, navigation, herbal knowledge, cunning diplomacy, subtly shaped the outcomes of raids, negotiations, and even social hierarchies. Their influence was invisible to most, but tangible to those who depended on them for survival or strategic insight. The quiet resilience of these women was extraordinary. They endured captivity, brutal conditions, superstition, and often brutal men, yet they adapted, resisted, and in some cases, thrived. They were the silent historians, teachers, strategists, and occasionally warriors of their time. And despite being cast as victims in many narratives, they left traces that reveal intelligence, courage, and agency in an otherwise chaotic and violent world. By the end of long voyages, some nuns had secured new identities, some continued to resist quietly, and a few would rise to positions of authority in foreign lands. Their stories, though often overlooked, offer a rare glimpse of survival, cunning, and influence exercised under extreme conditions. And while the Vikings' fame is often recorded in sagas of battle and plunder, these women left subtler legacies, ones of wit, adaptability, and enduring resilience. Survival, strategy, and the legacy of captive nuns. Let's drift now to the quieter, subtler aspects of life after the longships reached distant ports. By this stage, the nuns had evolved from mere captives to indispensable actors in the Viking world. They were no longer just survivors. They had become strategists, observers, and, in some sense, quiet influencers of decisions that shaped raids, trade, and diplomacy. Take Sister Ethelflaed, for instance. By the time she reached Constantinople, she had mastered the art of reading both stars and people. Navigating the Mediterranean wasn't easy, and the sailors often relied on instinct over calculation, which could be dangerous. Ethelflaed's charts, combined with her keen observation of currents and tides, made her invaluable. The Vikings may have been the muscle, but she was the brain, quietly orchestrating safer passages and subtly asserting influence over the crew's decisions. Meanwhile, Sister Brigida's cunning had only sharpened. Her runic tattoos weren't just symbolic. They had become tools of psychological influence. Legends circulated that any man who ignored her advice or disrespected her presence would meet with bad luck, illness, or unexpected misfortune. Whether or not these curses were real is debatable, but perception is power. And in a superstitious world like the Viking era, belief often mattered more than reality. Other nuns found survival through subtle manipulation and adaptation. They learned which captains were mercurial, which sailors could be persuaded, and which tasks allowed them slight leverage. A misaligned sail, a carefully prepared meal, or whispered advice at the right moment could influence outcomes, sometimes saving lives or altering the course of a raid. These acts were rarely overt, but they were effective. Life in Constantinople was a study in cultural adaptation. Some nuns were sold into harems, or households where their monastic skills became surprisingly useful. Literacy, knowledge of herbs, cooking, and even negotiation made them valuable beyond mere servitude. A few women managed to navigate these complex hierarchies, gaining influence in ways that would have been unimaginable back in England. One or two even commanded small fleets, using their knowledge of the sea and human psychology to survive, a quiet inversion of the roles they were forced into. Back on the northern seas, Viking crews sometimes recounted tales of the nuns' ingenuity. Ships' logs, sagas, and carvings hint at incidents like hallucinations caused by poisoned mead, runic curses, and the uncanny ability of nuns to guide fleets safely through treacherous waters. Some of these stories sound exaggerated, but archaeological evidence, battle scars on bones, gold teeth looted from Byzantine treasures, confirms that these women were active participants in a violent, complex world. And let's not forget their quiet rebellion. While they survived by cooperating and complying when necessary, they also resisted in subtle ways. Every prayer muttered, every herbal remedy applied, every small sabotage act was a form of agency. These weren't dramatic, cinematic battles. They were quiet, daily negotiations between life, survival, and the assertion of identity. It's fascinating to consider the mental endurance required. Imagine a young nun, barely a teenager, navigating stormy seas, hallucinations, and the constant threat of violence, all while maintaining spiritual discipline. Meditation, prayer, and mental exercises were essential, not just for comfort, but as tools for strategy and subtle resistance. These women maintained their sense of self when the world around them sought to erase it. Interestingly, some of the nuns' acts had long-term consequences. Those who survived into foreign courts or maritime communities carried knowledge and skills that influenced trade, navigation, and local politics. Their experiences became part of an informal historical record, passed down through oral tradition, carvings, and eventually archaeological finds. They were survivors, yes, but also inadvertent educators, advisors, and strategists whose impact quietly shaped the world around them. Even the most mundane aspects of life aboard the longships became arenas for subtle control. Tasks like rowing, cooking, or observing the skies allowed nuns to assert influence in ways the Vikings may not have consciously acknowledged. Every small act, from misaligning an oar to advising on currents, was a negotiation of power, survival, and identity. By the time the nuns reached the end of their long journeys, they had become a strange blend of captive, strategist, healer, and historian. They had endured the worst and used wit, courage, and faith to shape their fates. And though their stories are often buried under the grand narratives of Viking raids and conquests, archaeology and sagas hint at their profound influence. In the end, these women exemplify resilience in a world designed to strip agency from them. Their bones, scars, and faint traces in chronicles tell stories of survival, cleverness, and the quiet power of intellect over brute force. From star charts to poisoned mead, runic tattoos to diplomacy, they left marks on history that continue to echo centuries later. So, as the longships finally returned to calmer waters, with storms behind them and distant lands ahead, the nuns' influence was clear. They were more than survivors. They were navigators, teachers, strategists, and, in subtle ways, rulers of the spaces they occupied, even in captivity. Nuns as unlikely agents of influence and survival. Now let's drift further into the subtle power these women wielded. By this point in their journeys, the nuns were no longer simply surviving. They were shaping outcomes in ways that the Vikings rarely understood. They became, almost invisibly, critical to the success of raids, the safety of longships, and even the fortunes of distant settlements. Sister Ethelflaed, for example, had refined her navigational expertise to near perfection. She could read tides, stars, and even subtle cues from the wind to determine where shoals or hidden reefs lay. To the Vikings, it must have seemed like quiet magic, a small, silent woman guiding mighty ships through unseen dangers. And in truth, there was a kind of magic in her calm confidence, in the quiet knowledge that one small error could spell disaster for all. Sister Brigida, meanwhile, continued her psychological influence through runes, rituals, and quiet intimidation. The crew whispered that her curses were real, and the men's behavior subtly shifted. A captain would pause before giving rash orders. A sailor might hesitate in rowing, and murmurs of superstition spread through the ship like a gentle wind. The nuns' perceived power became real power, and it required no violence to wield it. Even the smaller acts mattered. Misaligned oars, slightly oversalted food, a whispered warning or prayer. These were all tools of influence. The nuns learned how to manipulate the rhythms of the ship without overt confrontation. Life on a longship, after all, was a game of observation, timing, and subtle strategy. Every move counted, and the nuns were masters of this quiet chess. Meanwhile, the longships themselves were microcosms of society. Hierarchies were fluid, shaped by strength, superstition, and skill, and the nuns occupied a strange space within this social structure. Simultaneously vulnerable and influential, powerless and indispensable. They were observers of human behavior, chroniclers of the subtleties of leadership, loyalty, and fear. In many ways, their captivity offered a lens into Viking society that few outside observers would ever experience. The nuns' survival strategies extended beyond the ships. In foreign ports like Dublin or Constantinople, they had to navigate entirely different cultures. language, custom, and hierarchy all became tools and obstacles. Some nuns were sold into households or harems, where their literacy, knowledge of herbs, and subtle diplomacy made them valuable. Others adapted to maritime life, eventually commanding ships or advising fleets, a remarkable inversion of their original roles. Their spirituality remained central, even under extreme duress. Prayer, ritual, and meditation were not just comfort. They were strategic tools. A calm mind allowed clear judgment, subtle intervention, and the ability to endure months of stress. Maintaining their monastic practices gave the nuns a sense of identity and control, which, in a world dominated by men, fear, and chaos, was itself a form of power. Interestingly, their influence extended into the realm of legend. Viking sagas and later carvings hint at the nuns' intelligence, courage, and cunning. Stories of hallucinations caused by poisoned mead, runic curses, and uncanny navigational skills circulated widely. While exaggeration was inevitable, these tales underscore the lasting impression these women left on both their captors and history. The psychological endurance of the nuns is striking. Imagine a young woman, barely a teenager, facing storms, hallucinations, and constant threats, yet maintaining composure, strategy, and faith. Their resilience was intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. Each day was a negotiation between compliance and subtle rebellion, between survival and influence, between fear and clever manipulation. Even mundane tasks carried significance. Cooking, rowing, tending to injured sailors, each offered an opportunity for agency. A slightly misaligned sail, a careful application of herbs, or whispered advice could shift outcomes in ways that were almost invisible, but deeply effective. Survival depended not only on physical endurance, but on wit, perception, and the ability to act strategically without drawing attention. By the time some nuns reached Constantinople or returned to Scandinavia, their experience had transformed them. They were no longer passive captives. They were tacticians, healers, navigators, and sometimes leaders. Their knowledge shaped decisions aboard ships, in households, and even in foreign courts. Their lives challenged conventional ideas of victimhood, showing that intelligence, courage, and subtlety can carve out power even in extreme circumstances. The nuns' stories, though often overlooked, are preserved in archaeological evidence. Battle scars, gold teeth looted from Byzantine treasures, carvings showing women wielding weapons, and fragmented written records. Each piece testifies to their agency and influence, subtle, quiet, but enduring. They were actors in history whose presence shaped outcomes far beyond their immediate survival. And so, the nuns of Lindisfarne, through intelligence, faith, and strategy, transformed captivity into a landscape of subtle power. They endured, they adapted, and they influenced, leaving legacies that ripple through sagas, archaeology, and history itself. In the quiet moments aboard longships, in the subtle manipulations and whispered prayers, they became more than survivors. They became architects of their own destinies, even under the shadow of steel and superstition. From captivity to influence, nuns in new lands. Let's drift now to the nuns who survived long voyages and reached foreign lands. By this point, the journey was no longer just about survival at sea. It was about adaptation, influence, and the unexpected roles they assumed in unfamiliar societies. Some were sold into households, others into harems, and a few became integral to maritime operations in ways historians rarely highlight. Sister Ethelflaed, for instance, used her navigational knowledge to influence trade routes and fleet movements. She advised captains on currents, tides, and hidden dangers, often preventing disaster. The Vikings' respect for her abilities grew quietly, and though she had no formal authority, her counsel was heeded. A remarkable inversion of the social hierarchy. She had gone from captive to strategist, navigating not only waters but human behavior with subtle finesse. Sister Brigida's runic skills continued to impress and intimidate. Rumors of curses and misfortune spread among sailors and merchants alike. Vikings, already prone to superstition, often deferred to her judgment in minor matters, from where to anchor to how to distribute provisions. The psychological edge she wielded was invisible yet potent. proving that perception can be as powerful as physical might. For other nuns, survival meant adapting to entirely new cultural norms. Constantinople offered a complex society with intricate hierarchies, and some women navigated it with surprising skill. They leveraged literacy, knowledge of herbs, and diplomacy to carve out positions of relative security. A few even rose to influence, becoming advisors, translators, or in rare cases, commanding small maritime operations. It as a striking shift, from cloistered life in Lindisfarne to wielding quiet power in a distant city across the Mediterranean. Daily life in these foreign lands required patience, observation, and subtlety. The nuns learned languages, adapted customs, and discovered which actions would earn favor without provoking hostility. Survival was no longer just physical endurance. It required social intelligence, discretion, and an uncanny ability to read people. In many cases, their ability to navigate these complexities determined not only their own fates, but the success of the operations they assisted with. Interestingly, their religious and spiritual practices continued to anchor them. Even while serving in households, harems, or aboard foreign fleets, the nuns maintained prayer and meditation. This quiet devotion was both a source of resilience and a subtle assertion of identity. It reminded them, and occasionally their captors, that despite the roles they were forced into, they remained themselves, capable, intelligent, and resilient. The nuns also became inadvertent educators. Those who had survived long voyages shared knowledge of navigation, herbs, and language with sailors and local communities. This information often proved invaluable, enhancing trade, maritime safety, or local defense. Though history rarely credits them, these women functioned as vectors of knowledge, subtly shaping the societies they touched. Even the smallest acts carried significance. Preparing a meal, tending a wound, or adjusting sails were opportunities to assert agency. Small, deliberate choices allowed them to influence outcomes without overt confrontation. Each act reinforced their survival, their influence, and their subtle power in a world structured around domination and fear. Yet danger never fully receded. The threat of violence, disease, or betrayal remained constant. Vikings could be unpredictable, and foreign rulers often treated captives as tools rather than individuals. The nuns' survival depended on vigilance, intelligence, and adaptability, qualities they honed over months of perilous voyages and uncertain settlements. Through all this, the nuns' legacy slowly took shape. Archaeological finds, bones with battle scars, gold teeth looted from Byzantine treasures, and occasional carvings of women wielding weapons hint at the quiet power these women held. They were not simply victims of history, they were participants, observers, and in some cases, architects of events far beyond their original world. Ultimately, the nuns' stories are testimonies of resilience and agency. From the dragon-headed longships of the North Sea to distant Mediterranean ports, they navigated captivity, adaptation, and influence with remarkable skill. Through cunning, intellect, and subtle rebellion, they transformed the circumstances imposed upon them into opportunities for survival, influence, and occasionally leadership. Even centuries later, their presence echoes through history, in sagas, archaeological evidence, and the faint traces of legend. They remind us that even in worlds dominated by violence and hierarchy, intelligence, faith, and resilience can carve paths that defy expectation. In quiet ways, these women shaped the course of events, leaving legacies that continue to intrigue historians and archaeologists alike. From legends to archaeology, traces of nuns across history. Now, let's drift into the lasting impressions these women left on history. While sagas often celebrate the exploits of Viking warriors, ships, and conquests, the quiet resilience of the nuns is woven into the margins, a subtle, enduring thread of agency, intellect, and survival. And surprisingly, archaeology has begun to illuminate their stories in ways that written accounts sometimes overlook. Consider the bones discovered under Oslo's harbor in 2022. Scholars analyzed them meticulously, noting battle scars, gold teeth, and other artifacts that suggested unusual circumstances for women of the era. These were not simply victims. They bore evidence of struggle, resistance, and a degree of adaptation that indicates active engagement with the world around them. Some scholars even suggest that these were nuns who had survived multiple raids, long voyages, and harsh captivity, adapting to survive in ways both clever and physically demanding. Runic inscriptions, like those attributed to Sister Brigida, offer another dimension of evidence. These markings, tattooed on skin or carved into objects, were more than decorative. They were tools of psychological influence, ways to shape perception, and subtle acts of rebellion. Vikings, deeply superstitious as we've noted, often deferred to or feared these symbols. Even if the curses were imagined, their effects were tangible: hesitation, caution, and strategic advantage in favor of the nuns. Artifacts like stolen star charts, fragments of monastic manuscripts, and herbal concoctions discovered in shipwrecks or trade hubs also hint at the broader roles these women played. They were navigators, educators, and healers. Their knowledge wasn't merely utilitarian. It allowed them to exert influence, survive dangerous voyages, and in some cases, negotiate or manipulate social hierarchies to their advantage. Interestingly, some nuns' survival strategies evolved into outright leadership in foreign territories. Accounts suggest that a few women, initially captives, eventually commanded ships, influenced fleets, or assumed advisory roles in foreign courts. From cloistered halls in Lindisfarne to the bustling harbors of Constantinople, they leveraged intelligence, skill, and patience to transform captivity into opportunity. In an era dominated by men, this kind of agency was subtle but profound. It's also worth noting the psychological endurance required. Imagine young women, taken from monasteries, thrust onto longships with hallucinating crews, navigating storms, fear, and superstition. Yet they maintained prayer, meditation, and subtle acts of resistance. Every quiet decision, aligning an oar, advising on currents, preparing meals, or healing the sick, was a negotiation with both circumstance and captors. Their calm intelligence created ripples that affected the outcomes of raids, voyages, and trade. Cultural adaptation became another survival tool. Nuns sold into households or harems in Constantinople learned local customs, languages, and politics. Some converted religions strategically, others leveraged literacy or herbal knowledge to gain influence. These women weren't simply enduring. They were thriving in a constrained, dangerous environment, crafting lives that blurred the line between captivity and authority. Even the Viking sagas hint at these subtle legacies. Tales of hallucinations induced by poisoned mead, uncanny navigational skill, and women wielding axes suggest that their influence left impressions strong enough to become legend. While myth often embellishes, the combination of archaeology, saga literature, and fragmentary manuscripts offers compelling evidence that these nuns were active participants in history, not passive victims. Every small act of cleverness, whether misaligned sails, whispered advice, or prayers muttered at dawn, represents a negotiation of agency in a world designed to suppress it. And over decades, these cumulative actions left traces in material culture, oral history, and even the strategic operations of Viking raiding and trading networks. So, as we reflect on the legacy of these remarkable women, it becomes clear that they were more than survivors. They were agents of subtle influence, educators, navigators, and, in some cases, rulers in miniature, shaping events in ways that only careful scholarship and archaeological interpretation can uncover. In the quiet corridors of monasteries, aboard dragon-headed ships, and within distant ports, the nuns of Lindisfarne left an indelible mark, a reminder that resilience, intelligence, and subtlety can ripple through history in unexpected ways. Their stories challenge conventional narratives of conquest and captivity. Instead of focusing solely on violence, these histories highlight survival, adaptation, and the unexpected power of those whom the world sought to render powerless. And though they may never have wielded swords on the battlefield, their influence traveled silently, leaving evidence in bones, inscriptions, and faint traces of legend. Echoes beneath the waves, the lasting legacy of the Viking nuns. Let's settle in one last time. The candles are low now, and the waves against the Viking hull are gentle, almost a whisper. History, like the tide, always seems to return to the same shore. And as we drift toward the end of this strange, haunting journey, we find ourselves asking what truly became of those nuns who vanished into the dark wake of a dragon ship. Centuries passed, kingdoms rose and fell, monasteries burned and were rebuilt, and yet, quiet stories of the women who sailed unwillingly lingered, half folklore, half memory. In the Icelandic sagas, they appear as star wives, foreign women who could read the skies and calm storms. In Irish folklore, they become the sea brides, veiled figures said to bless sailors who carried a token of their homeland. But somewhere between those poetic retellings and the archaeological record, the truth has always floated just beneath the surface. Modern historians pieced together fragments. A chalice from Lindisfarne found buried in a Viking trading outpost, a piece of embroidery depicting a cross beside a longship, and human remains with both Celtic and Norse DNA. Each clue suggested the same quiet conclusion. Some of these women never returned home because they became part of the world that took them. Their faith merged with Norse belief systems, their language with Old Norse dialects, their children with Viking bloodlines. And maybe that's the strangest twist of all. The very raiders who sought to erase their world ended up preserving pieces of it, through genes, through language, through the stories their descendants told around winter fires. It's the kind of irony history loves best. Let's float for a moment to the Eastern Mediterranean, where the surviving records of the Byzantine slave markets mention foreign women with fair hair and crosses tattooed behind their ears. Two such entries from the mid-9th century describe women sold not as servants, but as navigators and interpreters of the Western tongue. They might well have been the last of those taken from Lindisfarne. One account even mentions a woman known only as the Saxon Bride, who later commanded a merchant vessel between Crete and Cyprus. A faint echo of that early trauma turned to mastery of the sea. Of course, history doesn't tell us everything. For every bone uncovered and inscription translated, there are hundreds lost to salt and silence. The North Sea swallowed thousands of ships, their stories preserved only in the murmuring currents and the faint glitter of relics found centuries later. But when divers found the 9th century longship beneath Oslo's harbor, the one containing those gold-toothed skeletons and Byzantine trinkets, they also found something far smaller and perhaps far more human. A tiny silver crucifix carved crudely from melted coins. It wasn't Norse in design, it was Anglo-Saxon, which means that one of those women, or someone who remembered her, had carried her faith, literally melted and reshaped, across oceans and empires. It's easy to imagine her doing it quietly, during a long voyage, while the men argued about winds and omens. A small, defiant act of creation in a world that had stolen nearly everything else from her. And that, in the end, is what defines their legacy. Not the raids, not the gold, not even the violence that began it all. But survival. Deliberate, intelligent, quiet survival. These women endured not by matching their captors' brutality, but by outlasting it. They learned, adapted, and changed the cultures that consumed them. They were absorbed into Viking sagas, Norse myth, Byzantine legend, and even early Islamic maritime lore, like faint constellations of human persistence scattered across time. If you stand on the rocky shore at Lindisfarne today, the wind still hums through the ruins of the old monastery. Seabirds scream. The tide creeps over the stones just as it did in 795, and if you listen long enough, you might hear the echo of oars, the creak of leather, and the murmur of women's voices, prayers in Old English mingling with Norse chants. History rarely grants them names, but their presence lingers. Somewhere in those restless waves lies the line between captivity and transformation, between the women who were taken and the legends they became. They began as nuns of the Northumbrian coast, cloistered, silent, obedient. They ended as sailors, witches, navigators, traders, and myth. The world remembers the Vikings for their raids, but perhaps it should remember the nuns for something far more impressive, their quiet refusal to disappear. So tonight, as we close our eyes and let this story drift back into the dark, remember, history isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it's whispered by the ones who survived long enough to outlive them. In 795 AD, Viking raiders stormed a quiet monastery and vanished into legend. But the story of the 12 captured nuns didn't end there. From slave markets in Dublin to the palaces of Byzantium, these women endured, adapted, and left their mark on the very world that tried to erase them. Their faith melted into new gods, their voices into new tongues, and somewhere between prayer and survival, they became legends of their own. So tonight, as the waves fade and the candles burn low, remember, not every captive stayed silent. Sleep easy and let history whisper. You're watching Stories Before Sleep.